ex-husband and his mistress went to a party and unexpectedly ran into his stunning ex-wife. When Jason Crawford walked into that charity gala with his new girlfriend on his arm, he expected to own the room like he always did. What he didn't expect was to see the ghost of his greatest mistake materialize across the ballroom, transformed into something he no longer recognized. His ex-wife Ivy wasn't supposed to be there. More importantly, she wasn't supposed to look like that. She was supposed to be broken, defeated, erased from the social circles they once shared. Instead, she stood there radiating a power that made his carefully constructed world begin to crack at the foundations. This wasn't just an awkward encounter. This was the moment Jason realized that sometimes the person you destroy has a way of rising from the ashes and burning brighter than you ever allowed them to shine. What happens when the woman you discarded shows up looking like she never needed you in the first place? Keep watching, because this reunion will change everything you thought you knew about winning and losing. The penthouse overlooking Central Park had become Ivy Monroe's sanctuary. For 2 years since her divorce from Jason Crawford had been finalized, these walls had witnessed her complete metamorphosis. The space was nothing like the cold, minimalist mansion she'd shared with Jason, all chrome and glass and expensive emptiness. This place breathed with life, filled with color, texture, and personality, everything Jason had systematically trained her to suppress. Tonight, draped across her vintage chaise lounge, was a dress that would change everything. Midnight blue silk that shimmered like starlight, custom designed by an independent fashion house whose talent Ivy had discovered and quietly invested in. It was a masterpiece that cost more than Jason's monthly car payment, and it was worth every penny. Beside it lay the invitation printed on cream cardstock with elegant silver lettering. The annual winter charity gala benefiting arts education, an event she and Jason had attended together for 5 consecutive years, an event she had every logical reason to avoid. Her therapist, Dr. Patricia Chen, had called it during their last session. Going back into that space isn't about him, Ivy. It's about you reclaiming territory you surrendered without a fight. You're not the same woman who left that world. It's time they all knew it. Drop a comment below if you've ever had to face someone who thought they'd seen the last of you. For 7 years, Ivy had been Mrs. Jason Crawford, wife to the hedge fund manager who'd made his first $100 million before turning 35. She had played her role flawlessly, elegant at fundraisers, charming at business dinners, silent when his colleagues made crude jokes, invisible when her own opinions might overshadow his authority. Jason hadn't just married her, he'd reconstructed her. He'd taken the vibrant, opinionated woman he'd met at a charity auction and slowly, methodically molded her into his ideal accessory. Her love of bold fashion became too attention-seeking. Her passion for supporting emerging artists became wasteful spending on nobodies. Her desire to pursue her MBA became unnecessary when you have me to take care of you. The affair with Miranda Chen, his 28-year-old executive assistant, hadn't come as a shock. By the time Ivy discovered the text messages, she'd already been so diminished that she almost believed she deserved it. Miranda understands ambition, Jason had said when confronted, not apologetic but almost annoyed at having to explain. She's hungry, driven, she pushes me to be better. You've become comfortable, complacent. As if her 7 years of devotion, of sacrificing her own dreams to support his, of becoming smaller so he could feel bigger, had somehow made her the villain in their story. The divorce had been savage. Jason's legal team had painted her as a gold digger who'd contributed nothing to his success. They'd implied she was unstable, emotionally manipulative, desperate. Her own attorney had urged her to take the settlement and vanish quietly. Don't let him destroy you publicly. Take the money and rebuild somewhere else. So she'd signed the papers, accepted the settlement, and disappeared from their shared social circle like she'd never existed at all. But disappearing, it turned out, had been exactly what she needed. Ivy moved to her floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawling beneath her like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. 24 months of intensive self-reconstruction. She'd started with therapy, excavating the layers of damage Jason had inflicted, learning to recognize her own worth again. Then she'd pursued her MBA at Columbia, graduating at the top of her class. She'd launched an investment firm specializing in women-owned businesses and emerging creative ventures. Her first fund had raised $20 million. Her second had doubled that. Her third was currently sitting at $75 million, with investors fighting for positions. She'd been profiled in Forbes, interviewed on Bloomberg, invited to speak at conferences around the world. She was building an empire, and she was doing it as herself, unapologetically. The gala invitation had arrived 6 weeks ago, addressed to Ivy Monroe, CEO and founder, Monroe Capital Partners. Not Jason's ex-wife, not Mrs. Crawford, just Ivy, standing on her own considerable merits. She'd almost declined. Then she'd remembered Dr. Chen's words. Your absence is still letting him control you. Your presence, thriving and unbothered, that's freedom. So she'd commissioned the midnight blue dress. She'd scheduled appointments with the city's top stylist and makeup artist. She'd prepared to walk back into that world, not as Jason's discarded wife, but as a woman who'd transformed her pain into power. Hit that subscribe button if you believe that sometimes the best revenge is success, because what happens next will remind you that living well is the ultimate comeback. The ballroom at the St. Regis was a study in opulence. Crystal chandeliers dripped light across marble floors. Manhattan's elite moved through the space in their designer armor, air-kissing and networking with practiced precision. This was the battlefield where fortunes were made and reputations destroyed, where social currency meant everything. Ivy emerged from the elevator, and the room seemed to hold its breath. The midnight blue dress hugged her curves like liquid midnight, its subtle shimmer catching every movement. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant twist that showed off the diamond earrings she'd bought herself. No gift from a man, earned by her own brilliance. Her makeup was understated but flawless, emphasizing the confidence in her eyes rather than hiding behind artifice. She walked into that ballroom like she owned it, because she knew something now that she hadn't known 2 years ago. Her worth had never been tied to Jason Crawford's opinion of her. Conversations stuttered as she passed. Heads turned. She could see the recognition dawning on familiar faces, followed by shock, then something that looked remarkably like awe. This wasn't the diminished woman who'd slipped away quietly. This was Ivy Monroe, and she was magnificent. Champagne? A waiter appeared at her elbow with perfect timing. "Thank you," she said, accepting the glass with a smile that held no nervousness, only anticipation. "Ivy? Ivy Monroe?" She turned to find Catherine Rothstein, the charity's board president, approaching with genuine delight. Catherine was old money, the kind of woman whose approval could make or break social standing. "Catherine," Ivy said warmly, "it's wonderful to see you." "My dear, you look absolutely radiant," Catherine said, taking both of Ivy's hands in hers. "I've been reading about your ventures in the financial press. What you're doing for women entrepreneurs is revolutionary. We need to talk about getting you on our investment committee." Ivy felt warmth bloom in her chest. In her old life, Jason had done all the important conversations while she'd been relegated to planning seating charts. Here was one of New York's most influential philanthropists treating her as an equal. "I'd be honored," Ivy replied. Catherine's expression shifted slightly, her gaze moving to something over Ivy's shoulder. "Well," she said quietly. The evening just became infinitely more interesting. Ivy didn't need to turn around. She could feel the change in the room's energy, the way conversations became more animated, more performative. Jason had arrived. This is the moment everything changes. Don't go anywhere. Jason Crawford entered the ballroom like a king surveying his kingdom. At 39, he was still conventionally handsome in the way that wealth and grooming could manufacture attractiveness. His tuxedo was bespoke, his watch worth more than most people's cars, his smile the practiced expression of a man who'd never questioned his own importance. On his arm was Miranda Chen, stunning in crimson silk that announced her presence like a declaration of war. At 28, she possessed the kind of beauty that came from youth and ambition in equal measure. Her dress was cut dangerously low, designed to remind everyone that she was young, desirable, and had won the ultimate prize, Jason Crawford's attention. They moved through the crowd accepting congratulations and greetings. Jason's latest acquisition, a struggling tech company he'd gutted and flipped for massive profit, had been splashed across the Wall Street Journal. Tonight was his victory lap, his reminder to everyone that he was untouchable. "Baby, you promised you'd introduce me to the Vanderbilt heir," Miranda said, her voice carrying that slight edge of demand disguised as playfulness. "Patience, sweetheart," Jason murmured, his hand possessive on her waist. "Let them come to us. We're the story tonight." His gaze swept the room in his habitual assessment, cataloging who was present, who mattered, who might be useful. His eyes moved over familiar faces, potential business partners, social climbers hoping for his acknowledgement. And then he saw her. The champagne glass stopped halfway to his lips. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Jason Crawford looked like a man who'd been struck by lightning. Ivy stood near the center of the room, laughing at something Catherine Rothstein was saying. The sound of her laughter, genuine and unrestrained, cut through him like a blade made of memory and regret. This was impossible. This wasn't the woman he'd left. The woman he'd left wore beige and avoided attention, and apologized for existing. This woman commanded space without effort, drew every eye in the room, radiated the kind of confidence he'd spent years convincing her she didn't possess. She was breathtaking, and she was supposed to be gone. "Jason!" Miranda's voice seemed to come from underwater. "Jason, what are you staring at?" He couldn't answer, couldn't move, couldn't process what he was seeing because across the crowded ballroom Ivy had turned, and her eyes had found his. Time stopped. The room full of New York's elite faded into background noise, leaving just the two of them suspended in a moment that contained their entire history. Every promise broken, every dream destroyed, every version of themselves they'd lost along the way. Ivy's expression was unreadable. No pain, no anger, no longing. Just a calm, steady gaze that seemed to see through every layer of armor he'd built, straight through to the hollow space where his soul should have been. Then she smiled. A small, polite smile that somehow managed to be more devastating than any tears could have been. She raised her champagne glass in the tiniest of acknowledgments, a gesture that could have meant anything or nothing, and turned back to her conversation as if he were just another guest, unremarkable and easily dismissed. It was Miranda's sharp gasp that broke the spell. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice suddenly venomous with understanding. "That's her. That's your ex-wife. That's what happens when the woman you thought you destroyed shows up looking like she never needed you at all. Watch what happens next. The first rule of social warfare among Manhattan's elite is never ever let them see you bleed." Jason Crawford had built his entire empire on his ability to control every situation, to dominate every room, to emerge victorious from every conflict. But as he watched Ivy move through the crowd with effortless grace, accepting greetings from people who'd turned their backs on her after the divorce, he felt his carefully constructed reality beginning to fracture. "She looks different," Miranda said, her voice tight with something she couldn't quite name. Jealousy? Fear? Recognition that the woman she'd helped destroy was now somehow more powerful than either of them? Different wasn't the word. Ivy looked like herself, the real self she'd been before Jason had systematically taught her to diminish everything that made her remarkable. She looked like the woman he'd fallen in love with at that charity auction 9 years ago, the woman who'd argued passionately about income inequality while everyone else made polite small talk about real estate and summer homes. He'd loved that fire once, then he'd spent 7 years extinguishing it. "Who is she talking to now?" Miranda demanded, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his arm. Jason forced himself to focus. Ivy was in animated conversation with David Sterling, the venture capital titan whose fund had launched 3 unicorns in the past 2 years. Then she moved to greet the governor's wife, followed by the CEO of one of the largest private equity firms in the world. She wasn't networking. She belonged there. How does she know these people? Miranda's voice was rising, drawing attention they didn't want. She's nobody. She was always nobody. She was never nobody, Jason said quietly, the truth tasting like ash in his mouth. I just convinced her she was. A memory surfaced, sharp and unwelcome. Ivy at a similar gala 5 years ago, presenting a brilliant proposal for microfinance programs supporting women entrepreneurs in developing nations. She'd been articulate, passionate, visionary. Afterward, he'd told her she'd embarrassed him by speaking too much, drawing too much attention to herself. "Let me handle the important conversations, Ivy. You're better at the personal connections, the soft stuff." He'd been systematically silencing her brilliance for years, and he was only now understanding what he'd destroyed. "We need to go over there," Miranda announced, already beginning to move. "We need to show everyone that you've upgraded, that she was just a stepping stone to me." Jason caught her arm, stopping her. "We're not doing anything. We're going to circulate, work the room, and pretend she doesn't exist." But it was already too late for that strategy. The entire ballroom was watching, waiting. In a world where entertainment came in the form of social destruction, the unexpected reunion of Jason Crawford and his ex-wife was the evening's main event. And then Ivy began walking toward them. She moved like royalty, the midnight blue dress flowing around her like water made of stars. Conversations quieted in her wake. Phone cameras lifted discreetly. This was the moment everyone had been anticipating without knowing it was coming. Jason felt his heart hammering against his ribs. Beside him, Miranda had gone rigid with barely concealed fury. They were trapped, pinned under a spotlight neither had requested, with nowhere to hide and no choice but to face the reckoning they'd never seen coming. "Jason," Ivy said when she reached them, her voice warm and perfectly modulated. "What a pleasant surprise." The words were polite, appropriate, exactly what any civilized ex-spouse might say. But her tone carried something else beneath the surface. Confidence, power, the subtle suggestion that she held all the cards and was simply deciding which ones to play. "Ivy." His voice sounded foreign, strained. You look incredible." "I feel incredible," she replied simply, and the ease with which she said it, the complete absence of performance, made it devastatingly true. "Thank you." She turned to Miranda with a smile that could have melted glaciers or frozen the sun, depending on your perspective. "And you must be Miranda. I've heard so much about you." Miranda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. In her crimson dress and dramatic makeup, she suddenly looked like a child playing dress-up next to Ivy's effortless sophistication, all flash and no substance. Yes, I'm Miranda Chen." Her voice came out higher than intended, defensive where it should have been confident. "How lovely," Ivy said, and somehow made the simple words feel like both a benediction and a dismissal. "I understand congratulations are in order on Jason's latest acquisition." The tech company flip was quite impressive. There it was, the first subtle strike. By framing the congratulations around Jason's business rather than their relationship, Ivy had reduced Miranda to an accessory, present but irrelevant to the conversation that actually mattered. "It was a team effort," Jason said quickly, trying to regain control of the interaction that was rapidly spiraling away from him. "Of course it was," Ivy agreed smoothly. "You always were excellent at recognizing talent and extracting maximum value from it." The words were perfectly innocent. The subtext was devastating. Everyone within earshot understood that she wasn't just talking about business strategy. She was talking about how he used people, how he'd used her, how he was undoubtedly using Miranda. This is what happens when a woman stops playing by rules designed to keep her small. Keep watching. Miranda, finally finding her footing, decided to go on the offensive. "Jason has told me so much about you, about your interests. It must be nice to have projects that keep you busy." It was a clumsy attack, the kind of patronizing dismissal that might have wounded the old Ivy, the one who'd been taught to doubt her own value. This Ivy simply smiled wider, and there was something almost predatory in the curve of her lips. "Projects?" she said thoughtfully, letting the word hang in the air. "Yes, I suppose you could call them that. though the 35 companies in my investment portfolio generating over 200 million in annual revenue might think of themselves as more than just my little hobbies. She paused, letting the number sink in. 200 million, more than Jason's last 3 deals combined. But then, Ivy continued, her voice still pleasant, still perfectly polite. I've always believed that what some people dismiss as hobbies, others recognize as callings. It's all about perspective, isn't it? The gathered crowd, because there was definitely a crowd now, pretending to admire the floral arrangements while hanging on every word, barely suppressed their gasps. Ivy Monroe's investment firm had been making waves in the financial press, but hearing the numbers stated so casually, with such confidence, was something else entirely. Jason felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't just the woman he'd left. This was the woman she'd always been before he'd systematically convinced her she was less than she was, before he'd dimmed her light so his could shine brighter. That's quite impressive, he managed, his voice sounding weak even to his own ears. Isn't it? Ivy's smile never wavered, but her eyes held something sharp and unforgiving. I have to thank you, actually. The divorce settlement gave me the capital to start my firm. It's remarkable what a woman can accomplish when she's not constantly being told her ambitions are unseemly or her dreams are impractical. Another perfect strike. She'd just publicly thanked him for enabling her success, while simultaneously revealing that he'd been the primary obstacle to her achieving it. The crowd was eating it up, phones discreetly recording what would undoubtedly be tomorrow's hottest gossip. Miranda, her face flushed with humiliation and rage, made one desperate final play. Well, some of us prefer to build our partner's empire rather than competing with them. Real partnership is about support, not rivalry. Ivy's laugh was like wind chimes in a summer breeze, light and musical, and somehow more cutting than any harsh words could have been. Oh, darling, she said, and the endearment felt like a weapon. I was never competing with Jason. Competition implies we were playing the same game. She turned back to Jason, and for just a moment, her mask slipped. He saw something in her eyes that made his chest ache. Not anger, not hurt, but pity. She pitied him. I should let you both get back to your evening, she said gently, her voice almost kind. I know how important these events are for maintaining relationships, and Miranda, it was truly enlightening to meet you. I hope you enjoy the rest of your night. With that, she turned and walked away, the midnight blue dress catching the light one last time as she disappeared into the crowd, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their own making. The gathered audience began to disperse, whispers following in her wake like wildfire. Jason stood frozen, watching her go, feeling something in his chest crack open, something that felt suspiciously like grief for everything he'd destroyed. When you realize you didn't lose your wife, you lost yourself. Don't click away. You need to see what happens next. The rest of the evening passed in a nightmarish blur. Jason went through the motions of working the room, shaking hands, making small talk, but his attention kept drifting to Ivy. She was everywhere and nowhere, floating through the crowd like she'd never been absent from it, like she'd been born to command these spaces. He watched her laugh with the hospital foundation director, deep in conversation about healthcare accessibility. He saw her comfort a young entrepreneur who looked overwhelmed, taking genuine interest in his sustainable fashion startup. He observed her gracefully deflect questions about their encounter, never stooping to gossip while somehow managing to elevate herself above the fray. This was the woman he'd convinced himself was holding him back. This woman who moved through his world with more natural authority than he'd ever possessed, who commanded respect without demanding it, who made power look effortless. She's really gotten under your skin, hasn't she? Miranda's voice cut through his thoughts, sharp with accusation. Jason turned to find her glaring at him, her earlier confidence completely shattered. She'd been growing more agitated as the evening progressed, her smiles becoming more forced, her grip on his arm more desperate. Don't be ridiculous, he said, but the denial sounded hollow even to him. I'm not blind, Jason. You've been watching her all night like she's some kind of goddess who came down from heaven to judge us all and find us wanting. There was more truth in her words than he wanted to acknowledge. She's my ex-wife. Of course I'm aware of her presence. She humiliated us, Miranda hissed, her voice rising dangerously. She made us look like fools in front of everyone that matters, and you're standing here acting like she's the second coming. She did win, Jason said quietly, the words escaping before he could stop them. The truth of it settled over him like a shroud. Miranda's face went white, then red. Excuse me? Look at her, Miranda. Really look at her. He gestured across the room where Ivy was saying her goodbyes, collecting cheek kisses and promises of lunch dates. She's successful, respected, genuinely happy. She's everything I told her she could never be, and she's achieved it all without me, despite me. She won. So what does that make us? Miranda's voice was shaking now, tears threatening to ruin her perfect makeup. What does that make me? Jason looked at the woman he'd left his wife for. Beautiful, ambitious, young, everything he thought he'd wanted. But standing here now, watching Ivy shine like a star he'd tried to extinguish, he felt only emptiness and shame. I don't know, he said honestly. I honestly don't know anymore. It was the wrong answer. Miranda's face crumpled, then hardened into something ugly and wounded. You know what? I'm done. I'm done with your baggage, your ex-wife, your inability to appreciate what you have standing right in front of you. She yanked off the diamond necklace he'd given her for Christmas and dropped it on the floor between them with a clatter that drew attention from everyone nearby. The gesture was dramatic, performative, and deeply satisfying for the dozen people who had stopped pretending not to watch. Find yourself a therapist, Jason. Or better yet, find yourself a time machine, because I'm not going to waste my 20s waiting for you to get over a woman who clearly got over you years ago. She turned and stalked away, her crimson dress a flag of wounded pride and righteous anger. Several people had witnessed the entire scene, their faces showing various degrees of shock and barely concealed delight. Jason Crawford, master of the universe, had just been publicly dumped twice in one evening by two different women in two very different ways. He stood alone in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by hundreds of Manhattan's most powerful people, and feeling more isolated than he'd ever felt in his entire life. The success he'd built, the empire he'd constructed, the image he'd so carefully crafted, none of it mattered anymore. It was all hollow, empty, meaningless, without someone to genuinely share it with, and the someone he'd systematically destroyed. Across the room, Ivy was moving toward the exit, accepting final goodbyes and well wishes from people who genuinely respected her. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged everywhere she went, who carried her own sense of worth like an invisible crown that everyone could somehow still see. As if sensing his gaze one final time, she looked up, and their eyes met across the crowded ballroom. This time, there was no polite smile, no social mask, no performance for the watching crowd. Just a moment of pure, unvarnished recognition between two people who had once loved each other and had somehow lost their way, or rather, one who deliberately destroyed the path they'd been walking together. She inclined her head slightly, not quite a nod, not quite a bow, but something that felt like forgiveness or closure, or maybe just a final goodbye. Then she turned and walked toward the exit, the midnight blue dress catching the crystalline chandelier light one last time before she disappeared into the night and out of his life, this time forever. Jason remained exactly where he was, rooted to the spot, watching the empty space where she had been just moments before, feeling the full weight of everything he'd lost and everything he would never, ever get back. He'd spent 7 years systematically tearing her down to build himself up, only to discover far too late that he'd been destroying the best thing that had ever happened to him. Sometimes the price of getting everything you thought you wanted is losing everything that actually mattered. 9 months later, Monroe Capital Partners was hosting an exclusive evening event at its impressive new headquarters. The converted warehouse in Tribeca had been transformed into a stunning modern gallery space showcasing the innovative work of women entrepreneurs from around the world. Ivy moved through the space with quiet, earned authority, ensuring every detail flowed smoothly. Every guest felt welcomed, every story got told. She wore charcoal gray tonight, a perfectly tailored suit that announced she was here for serious business, not performance or pretense. Her hair was pulled back in a sleek, professional ponytail, her makeup minimal and precise. She didn't need armor anymore. She had become the weapon, forged in the fire of her own reinvention. "Ivy, this is absolutely extraordinary," Catherine Rothstein said, approaching with genuine admiration lighting her distinguished features. "What you've built here, the impact you're having, it's going to change countless lives for generations to come." "That's always been the plan," Ivy replied with a warm smile that reached her eyes and meant it. "These women deserve champions, advocates, believers. I'm just grateful I get to be one of them." As Catherine moved on to examine the interactive displays showcasing success stories, Ivy allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. This was what she'd been meant to do all along: empower others, elevate voices, enable dreams. Not diminish herself to make someone else feel bigger, stronger, more important. "Excuse me, Miss Monroe." She turned to find a familiar figure standing hesitantly near the entrance, looking somehow smaller than she remembered. Jason Crawford looked different tonight, diminished somehow. He wore a simple dark suit instead of his usual showpiece tailoring, and his expression was carefully neutral, almost nervous, completely lacking his trademark arrogance. "Jason," she said, genuinely surprised but not unsettled. "This is unexpected. I hope you don't mind the intrusion," he said quietly, his voice lacking its usual commanding confidence. "I read about tonight's launch in the journal this morning. I wanted to see what you'd built, what you'd accomplished." Ivy studied him for a long moment, noting the new lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage, the way he held himself like someone who'd learned humility the hard way, through painful experience rather than choice. "Of course not," she said finally, meaning it. "You're welcome here." "Everyone is." He stepped inside properly, taking in the carefully curated displays of women-owned businesses, the sophisticated presentation, the undeniable evidence of success built on genuine passion and purpose rather than ego and exploitation. "It's truly remarkable, Ivy. All of this, what you've created here. I had no idea you had this kind of vision, this capacity for building something so meaningful." "You never asked," she said simply, without rancor or accusation. It was just a fact, stated plainly and honestly. They stood together in surprisingly comfortable silence for a moment, watching the crowd move through the space, celebrating stories of women who'd refused to be diminished, who'd insisted on their own worth despite a world designed to question it. "I owe you an apology," Jason said finally, the words clearly difficult but necessary. "A real one, not the corporate kind, for not seeing who you really were. For spending years actively trying to make you smaller, instead of celebrating how extraordinary you already were. For convincing you that your dreams were less important than mine, when they were actually more meaningful all along." Ivy studied his face carefully, seeing genuine regret there, real understanding of what he'd done and what it had cost them both. "Thank you for saying that. It matters. But you don't need my forgiveness, Jason. You need your own. That's the only forgiveness that will actually heal anything." It was perhaps the kindest thing she could have said, and somehow also the most devastating. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth of it, understanding that some doors, once closed, remain closed forever. "Are you happy?" he asked, something genuinely vulnerable in the question, like he was almost afraid of the answer. Ivy looked around her headquarters, at the women she was championing, at the businesses she was building, at the life she'd constructed from the ashes of her marriage. She thought about the person she'd become, the strength she'd discovered buried beneath years of being told she was weak, the power she'd learned to claim as her birthright. "Yes," she said simply, and the truth of it rang through the space between them. "I really, genuinely am happy. For the first time in years, maybe ever, I'm exactly who I'm supposed to be." "Good," Jason said quietly, and she could hear that he meant it. That's really good. You deserve it. You always did." He turned to leave, then paused at the door, looking back one final time. "For what it's worth, I think this is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Not just the business, not just the success, but you like this, in your element, being exactly who you were always meant to be before I tried to convince you to be someone else. But you see it now, Ivy said gently, offering him that much grace. That's something. That's growth. After he left, Ivy returned to her guests, to her entrepreneurs, to her work, to her carefully constructed life. She didn't watch him go, didn't wonder if she'd see him again, didn't spend even a moment hoping for reconciliation or second chances. She simply returned to doing what she loved, being exactly who she was always meant to be, living the life she'd built from scratch. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't destruction or public humiliation. It's transformation so complete that the past loses all power over your present. Sometimes the best way to win is to simply become so authentically, unapologetically yourself that the people who tried to diminish you become irrelevant to your story. And sometimes the woman who gets left behind, discarded like she never mattered, becomes the woman who was always supposed to be free to fly. What do you think about Ivy's journey from shadow to spotlight? Could you relate to her transformation and quiet triumph over adversity? Let us know in the comments below what part of her story resonated most with you. If this story of reinvention and self-discovery resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories of resilience, redemption, and the incredible power of becoming exactly who you were meant to be. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. Remember, your worth isn't determined by who stays or who leaves. It's determined by who you choose to become when they're gone. Sometimes the person who walks away from you is actually doing you the greatest favor of your life. They're giving you permission to become who you were always meant to be, setting you free to discover your own power. Now go out there and show the world what you're really made of. Your second act is waiting.